Welcome, everybody. This is the final webinar for the BEPSI, Business, Entrepreneurship, and Private Sector Engagement Community of Practice. And today we're going to have a rich discussion about empowering youth in agri-food systems. We're looking at a toolkit that was published a while ago. We have some of the authors and some researchers and people who have really been a part of making youth empowerment and positive youth development a reality, and specifically in the agriculture sector. Go ahead to the next slide and I'll introduce our champions and co-champions. So this is me, Laura Goldmark, co-champion of this community of practice. We have Jack Amondi, who is with us but cannot be speaking today. As many of you may know, there are demonstrations all over Kenya right now, demonstrating the tax law, against protesting the tax law. They're all over the country. He's in Nairobi, where the demonstrations are the strongest. They have taken over the Parliament building. So we hope that he stays safe, but we do encourage youth to speak up. And with me is Ilbudi, who is our co.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today.
So here's our agenda for today. I've just done this, introduced the community of practice. I'm going to then hand it over to my moderator in a minute, who's going to cover these elements in positive youth development in agri-food systems. We're going to be looking at evidence, and we're going to have an exercise today. We want to hear from you. We're going to have some sort of a Padlet, we think it is, and you're going to be sharing your thoughts, and we're going to kind of make some recommendations for the future and offer some resources going forward, since this webinar series won't be continuing, but we're going to send you off to connect with lots of our friends and other groups that exist. There you go. So this is who we are. And over the years, the next slide is where I really just want to recognize everybody who's contributed to the BEPSI community practice. Look at all of this. So we have some really great contributors. One of them is somebody who's brought the speakers that are on the webinar today together. Her name is Rachel Bloom. Many of you know her. She was at Global Communities, was at USAID, now works as a consultant, and has really been a leader in labor market assessments and positive youth development. We were lucky enough to have the economist Alec Hansen with us for several sessions as well. We were also lucky to have, we had a lot of Kenya representation, and we had Philippa Mary. We recently had Victor and Veronica in one of the last webinars over on the right. They all participate in the Global Opportunity Youth Network that is run by the Aspen Institute, but specifically the group from Mombasa. World Education was also a big contributor. And one of the best webinars we had early on was when we figured out the magic of kind of peer sharing, and that this is no longer, some sort of an expert forum, but it is, a place where people from all over the world can exchange. And we had a couple of USAID facilitators, and we had World Ed projects from, I think, 3 countries on sustainable livelihoods for adolescent girls. And then one more to call out was our entrepreneurship series that a lot of people, including ourselves, found inspiring. Ben Wald, who's the CEO of a company named Very, his company has continued to grow since he spoke in 2021. If any of you fly through airports in the US and you've seen that service Clear, Very did that. Their software designers were behind that technology. I also wanted to give a little bit of a shout out to Morocco. We had at least one session where we had great participation from some former colleagues in Morocco, including Nadia Amrani and Moulay Hafid Ben Slimane, who were experts in workforce development. So there's so much. And also just organizationally, we had IYF, FHI 360, so many organizations and people that contributed to these webinars. And we are here if you ever want to reach out to anybody in the group to help everybody stay in touch. So on that note, I'm really excited about today's webinar. If we can go to the next slide, I'll give you a preview of our speakers. We have Lisa Laxman, who's going to be the moderator and going to make sure you all are engaged and participating. And then she will be introducing also Hillary Proctor and Christine Allison. Thank you so much. Over to you, Lisa.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And if we could move to the next slide real quick, just to take a glance, this is who I am. I have a background in youth development and positive youth development strategy and worked on a federal level and was working with the Federal Interagency Working Group on Youth Programs in 2012 as USAID was in the process of putting together youth and development policy. So I had some input and some guidance into that. And as the efforts continued at USAID, I was at USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture as the division director. So just a overview about my background, but in the nearly 12 years that's been involved within the federal government and continuing now as a consultant. Let's move into the next slide though, because I guess part of what I want to just start here is just saying that we have an opportunity. In 2012, there was a youth bulge. That's what everybody was talking about and how we're engaging with youth. And in particular, how we were going to, quote, make youth become more involved. So there was a lot of conversation about engagement, empowerment, and that's where settling on positive youth development became a framework. But not only that, there was an aging population as farmers globally, not just domestically here in the US, but also internationally, and recognizing that the one thing that youth can be are change makers. So here was an opportunity to really look at youth engagement in agriculture. And in that process, that's how I met Hillary. So I'm going to flip it now to Hillary to talk more about setting the stage for PYD and agri-food systems.
Thanks, Lisa, for that great introduction. And I'm thrilled to be here to chat with everybody about some of the history of how did we get to where we are now, for sure. So to start out really quickly, as Lisa said, my name is Hillary Proctor, and I am a team member at Making Sense. There I serve as the Senior Director of Economic Opportunities and really oversee the economic engagement portfolio at Making Sense, which has allowed me to be involved with lots of fascinating work like this work here. I have a particular passion for agriculture. I have the opportunity to practice what I preach by living out in a cattle ranch in Western United States, where I telework from there. And so this topic is near and dear to my heart. So let's get started and let me tell you a bit about the history and really kind of how did we get started on this journey that we have. Way back in the time machine, pre-COVID in 2016, the Nigerian mission approached what was then Youth Power Learning, so the first iteration of YP2LE, and really was asking for support in designing their project appraisal document, oftentimes, really better known as a PAD, as they were really seeking to integrate the youth perspectives into their work and finding better ways of serving youth in agricultural activities. We had the opportunity to work with the mission over several months of collaboration, and it became pretty evident that there was a need for being able to provide some strategic and systematic guidelines of how to incorporate youth into the project design process. It was apparent that the initial decisions that the missions were making could either inadvertently include youth or exclude youth, and could propose some significant challenges for the implementers that were trying to be involved. So recognizing this gap and the importance of really bringing in these opportunities, we went back to the entity that had originally reached out to Youth Power Learning, and that was the Bureau for Food Security. So this was before it was renamed to RFS and some of those other iterations, which I know Christy Allison will get to. And our findings really deeply resonated with the BFS team. And they quickly brought us back on board for a partnership of being able to work closely and address these needs of being able to systematically support the missions. Next slide, please. So we jumped straight on in, and really what we found was that we needed to come forward and really come up with some leading guidelines about how to engage youth, how to support them systematically through the process. And our starting place, which we felt that was really important, was that youth are part of the solution. They really can be part of what makes an agri-food system strong and can address different challenges. And so from that basis, we started to then look back at what do missions need to do in order to really build on out and make sure that that lens is brought forward. And we found that we needed to have some guidance and to be able to have some structure to be able to find ways to actively bring young people into the design process and program cycle, to bring in different specialists and design ideas, and to bring in the expertise that is necessary really from a youth lens. We also surfaced on out the need to address that youth are not homogeneous. There are a lot of different target segmentations of youth, and how they're going to engage in agriculture is incredibly differently. So from there, we really started to build on out. Well, this means that we need a lot more information, and how our missions and how our program designer is going to bring that in, and what does an analysis look like of bringing those voices in. And lastly, how are we sure that we integrate that strong, positive youth development voice and approach throughout the entire process? Next slide, please. All right. One of the different tools that really came on out from this process was discovering the need to have a market systems approach that really aligned directly with the implementation that was expected as these activities move forward. So from here, we really started to dive on into the nuts and bolts and really thinking about how can young people be involved through this market systems approach to be able to strengthen and address. We focused on several key questions about how are youth currently involved in the value chains, where can youth access and benefits from this approach that is commonly used, and what rules facilitate or hinder their engagement in agriculture. Next slide, please. So what we ended up settling with was a guide, a series of guides actually, that really walked both implementers and designers through the process of a systematic engagement. We built out this 2 series that really, the first series, volume 1, focused in on how can USAID mission staff work to design and address some of those inherent challenges up front, and make sure that designs are inclusive and set the pathway forward for youth engagement. Volume 1 really follows the USAID program design cycle, and making sure that anybody from the mission would be able to go through a step-by-step with their workflow and find opportunities to really bring that lens to the forefront and make sure that they are setting up the further cycle for future success. When we get into volume 2, we really start getting into much more of that implementation and intervention level. This was designed both for implementers and maybe USAID staff who might be acting as a COR or an AOR or overseeing some of those implementation steps, and really looking in at how does the nitty-gritty really take place and how do we move from this larger design into a systematic implementation. Next slide, please. So along the process, we weren't doing this just in a vacuum. We were very fortunate to be able to have the insights and the perspectives from many different stakeholders throughout this entire design process of these guides. We had individuals from BFS that played key roles. We also had key figures in youth and agriculture development, like Thomas Jane from MSU, and our very own Lisa Lexman, who is on this webinar now. And we also had direct input from missions themselves. And Senegal in particular played a really active and key role in being able to provide us feedback on this process, as they were in a parallel process themselves. They were working on their pad development, and they were getting ready to release an RFA in mind for engaging youth in agriculture. And so it was an excellent opportunity to really be able to go back and forth of what are you doing, what does this look like, and what are some of the decisions that are being made. Next slide. And so in 2018, the Senegal mission launched the Feed the Future Senegal Youth and Agriculture activity, which really built on a lot of the key concepts that were coming out of this guide and the conversations that we were having. USAID really focused on looking for an entity that could help really strengthen the capacity and institutionalization of positive youth development within a learning situation and within an agricultural context. They also worked very hard at bringing in through their design the request for customizing training systems and really cultivating the entrepreneurship and employment opportunities in agriculture for youth. And then lastly, they really put forward what it was of prioritizing youth-friendly agricultural value chains and markets. What is it that works for these young people? And really how to foster the development of environments around them to ensure that there was positive engagement and success for young people as they step into this space. Next slide, please. So Virginia Tech was the entity that ended up implementing this activity and really moving it forward. This ended up being a very strong program that really looked at how to empower youth in agriculture in Senegal. Under the guidance of the mission, Virginia Tech was really able to look at sustainable agricultural practices and youth development and the emergence together, and focus in on the capacity building and the skills that Senegalese youth need in order to be successful in life and to be successful within the agricultural sector. They were able to build out partnerships with local communities, government agencies, educational institutions, and really be able to facilitate the adoption of different technologies and practices that were needed for both of that agricultural productivity, as well as developing and adopting the PYD principles and approaches. It also really focused in on the different target audiences of youth and really focusing in on the equal opportunities for young men and women from different backgrounds and how they might engage differently in this space. So in summary, this program gives a great opportunity for us to look at what it means to target youth in agriculture and to provide an opportunity for young people to excel and to further their advancement, and of taking the concepts from the guide and from the toolkit, from the mission level, all the way down to the implementation and seeing things in practice. So what I want to do now is hand things on over to Christy Allison, who is going to further the story and share about what's been happening more recently in learning about young people's pathways in agriculture and how we can support them. So over to you, Christy.
Thanks, Hillary. And go ahead and thank you so much. And you can go to the next slide. So my name is Christine Allison. Thank you so much for joining us today. Since July of 2020, I have had the great pleasure of being the team leader for the Youth and Agri-Food Systems Learning Activity, which is sponsored by the Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security in Washington. And go ahead to the next slide. The purpose of that activity is really to help USAID understand, looking back and looking forward, how has PYD really been applied within RFS programs and policies, and what have those impacts been, and how they can effectively engage youth as drivers of change in resilience and agri-food systems, and then how youth contribute. Originally, they were talking about country self-reliance, as that was, we were all on the journey to self-reliance at that point still, as things have changed. But really that has morphed into more of a understanding the evidence base we have for youth engagement in food security and agriculture activities and agriculture-led growth activities, as well as resilience, nutrition, and the other areas that REFS covers. But also understanding what is the strength of that evidence and what is the base here. So if we go to the next slide, one of the very first things we did under this new activity was to undertake an inventory, looking back to 2011, of as many of the activities as we could in USAID Feed the Future priority countries. And so you can see there on the screen what the list of countries was that we tried to review. And we went through a fairly thorough document review because we wanted to know, and often you have to get into the nitty gritty details, right, to find where's the detail, how did they engage youth, and what happened here. So as you can see, we looked through a mess of different documents. At the end of the day, we had 156 different activities that we included in this review for thorough assessment. And looking at those, we thought it would be useful to talk a little bit about what we've learned about how PYD was engaged, how youth have been engaged, looking back over, that decade of experience. So let's go to the next slide. Some key limitations before we look at the results. So one, as we said, it was looking primarily at those Feed the Future priority countries. So it was not inclusive of all USAID partner countries. There were many documents that weren't publicly available, and that was particularly true for cooperative agreements and grants. So things that don't, for example, get entered into USAID's Development Experience Clearinghouse, or documents that are used in the missions for program preparation, for example, prior to solicitation becoming public. Those kinds of documents we didn't have access to in many cases. So there are definitely some limitations we know about. We also thought it was a really important limitation that in many cases, youth-related efforts probably weren't clearly documented in some of those activity reports, for example. Especially for those larger scale activities, we know that they were engaging youth. Of course, they were engaging youth. They were working with large numbers of people in the ag sector in these countries, and just understanding the demographics in some of the partner countries, we know that's going to involve youth, right? So we know that in many ways this is an underreporting, but we think it's important to point out that there's an underreporting, because if we don't start reporting, then we don't really know, right? Our evidence base remains incomplete. So let's go to the next slide and see sort of what we saw. So of the 156 activities, 22 of those were specifically targeted to youth, similar to the one that Hillary mentioned in Senegal, for example. And just as a bit of a frame, we started with 2011 in part because that was really, as Lisa mentioned earlier, when the youth bulge was really grabbing everyone's attention and was important. And as I mentioned, the proportion of youth populations in many USAID countries is quite high. USAID partner countries is quite high. And we know that youth in many cases are concentrated in agriculture in many of those countries as well. So as we look at this, we can see that a number of those, the child-focused, youth-inclusive slice there, those were all nutrition programs. They were generally focused on children under 5. But the vast majority of activities were really adult-focused and youth-inclusive. So we had 14% of activities overall that were actually youth targeted. However, we did find in going through all those documents that overall 23% of the activities did actually involve youth in the design or the implementation or in the monitoring, evaluation, and learning activities held within those. So even though only 14% was specifically targeted to youth, another 9% of those activities did very intentionally engage youth at different, clearly at different stages in the activity. And I should note that we saw the frequency of that increased over time. So for example, the programs that were in 2018 or later had much greater participation of youth, or were clearer about reporting participation of youth, I should say, than the earlier programs. And so we did sort of like the trend line that we saw there. Next slide, please. We also dug into the theories of change because we wanted to understand how they thought they were going to engage youth and what the mechanisms were and sort of what was the logic process here. What we found was a little more lackluster on this front, right? Only 43% of the activities had available theories of change. And unfortunately, they were generally not very specific, right? They were very general and they didn't get into really understanding. There are lots of assumptions built in that were not identified. So we were not able to really understand where, in theory, these activities intended to have entry points for youth, or what supports youth might need, or what the interactions between the context and the activities might be to help, move things along. So in this case, the theories of change weren't terribly informative. I will note again, they improved over time, right? We saw stronger theories of change. We saw more theories of change as well over time. So things were moving in a good direction still, but not as clearly laid out as we might have hoped. Next slide, please. So where did we wind up? We had basically the 22 youth activities were focused in two areas. In Agri-Food activities, 7 of those were youth targeted. And as you can see, they tended to be what we call quasi-facilitation, high-intensity facilitation, looking really at, as Hillary mentioned, in the design and implementation guides that were developed, trying to make sure that youth had those supports. So those were important. There were also 2, I think we said 7, but there were 2 youth research, innovation, and knowledge management activities. And think of these as like the innovation hubs or the innovation centers that REFS supports around the world. So 2 of those did have specific youth targeted components as well. So that was important for us. Next slide. The other types of activities that tended to be much more youth focused were resilience. Of the 35 activities, 15 were specifically targeted at youth. So clearly there was more focus across the board on youth and resilience. And that I think was a very nice meshing, because the conceptual frameworks that USAID uses around resilience are quite well aligned with the PYD framework. So that was a nice marriage. And what we found was there were household approaches, and youth targeted activities tended to be those household approaches, where they focused on skills development, entrepreneurship support, village savings and loans associations, social capital development, technology transfer, and generally income generating activities. But the systems level approaches often also included that enabling environment for youth. So those were also, I would say, very youth friendly and youth sensitive type activities as well. So that was helpful in seeing sort of where that evolution was coming and where there are opportunities to really integrate youth needs and youth concerns very strongly into REFS programming. Next slide, please. So we also thought it would be useful to just do a recap and really look through and identify among those activities that did include youth in some way, shape, or form, how did they look at PYD? How did they integrate PYD? Most of them did not actually integrate PYD holistically. the majority looked at asset development. And as you can see there, it was primarily around training and capacity strengthening, support for entrepreneurship, or access to other assets. Some of them did have two. So they might, for example, have done assets and enabling environment. Very few actually did 3 or 4. And so those were important distinctions where we didn't really have as much of a holistic approach to PYD coming out of the sector as we might have. So for those that did, those handful that did focus on those 3 and 4, those were the youth targeted, where there was a very intentional focus on ensuring that agency and contribution were a part of that programming. Next slide, please. So what did we come to sort of as our conclusions? PYD was gaining traction, but many of the theories of change and program designs, particularly for the youth inclusive, but not youth targeted, specifically youth targeted activities, really didn't capture all of the elements of PYD that would be helpful in making youth successful. And we think too, and perhaps understanding all of the contexts and supports and sort of really building out sort of the kinds of understandings that we think are going to help the activities drive impact. Youth targeted projects were often limited to market-led skill acquisition, work experience, and employment placement. And that's good as far as it goes, but it's not building on what we know from the PYD experience and background and making sure that there's continuing support and then it becomes a virtuous cycle and not just sort of a one-sided intervention. We did also find there were some great models in some of those, and some of those models did create wonderful opportunities for on-farm, for off-farm, for non-farm employment and entrepreneurship, and were also helpful for private sector actors and increased productivity and quality and market expansion. So achieving everything we would hope to achieve through a youth inclusive market systems development kind of activity. So we know that there are ways to do it. Key gaps in the programming that we identified, though, in terms of fostering some of that, included really thinking through what does an agricultural TVET system look like. There are still gaps in education. Extension systems are weak in many USAID partner countries and don't reach as far into rural and remote areas as they would, hopefully, or could or might. Another key piece was really figuring out where you have youth engaged in household enterprises, farming enterprises. We really wanted to make sure that activities began to think about long-term family planning and succession planning into those outreach and extension activities, because there came points in many cases where they were training youth, but youth weren't the decision makers. And so they weren't able to apply the training or the work experience or the inputs that they were being offered through USAID supported activities. And that sort of lack of awareness about the limitations on decision making for youth was a key barrier in a handful of those. So I think that covers what I wanted to share with you. Next slide, and let's move on back to Lisa. Thanks.
And as I try to share my video briefly here, I would just love to hear from you all. This is our opportunity. We've got a lot of great information that's been shared on the challenges, the opportunities, the inventory of PYD over at least several years. And so let's take a moment and we're going to hear from you by allowing you to provide feedback and input using a Padlet. We're going to drop this information and I'm going to turn to Catherine to add into, I believe, the chat, the responses to some key questions. So here's what will happen. You're going to go to the Padlet link in the chat, add your responses. And the key questions that we're trying to find out is, have you used the toolkit? And if you have, what sections were most useful? And if not, which one of the tools could you use? What are some of the practices, entry points, or partnerships that best support youth engagement and empowerment in agriculture in your experience? What future resources would most help you to further empower youth in agriculture? So let's move to the Padlet. Everybody take a few moments here. You have about 15 minutes to write your responses. Is there anything else we need to add here? Any questions?
For anyone who may be newer to Padlet, all you have to do to post your reactions to these questions is click on one of the pluses under the question you'd like to respond to, and then you can insert a response with the subject line, with some more feedback or response that you have, and then you'll click publish. And if you have any challenges accessing the Padlet, you can also add any comments in the chat and we can add it for you.
So is there anyone who would like to also, if you're having difficulty with the Padlet, like to come off mic and share any of your verbal feedback? We'd love to hear from you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to try to turn the video on. I think what I need to say is easier speaking. Thanks to all very much for this very interesting seminar and your presentations. My name is Alejandra Eguiluz, and thank you for the invitation. I would like to share 3 lessons learned from a project that I ran when I was working for UNIDO in Morocco from 2002 to 2004. And this was a project on women's entrepreneurship. And it had a lot of women youth also in the project. We didn't have these tools then. They now seem like a lot of common sense, but someone has had to go through this common sense and write down in a structured way what needs to be done from the beginning. So thank you for that. I wish we had had these tools before, and now looking back, I do have some lessons with the lens of these tools now. The first one, so the producers were olive oil. The production was olive oil and also dried figs and prunes, those 2 value chains. The 3 lessons learned are the following. The first one, I think it was a challenge to know beforehand what the specific youth would need in the interventions. And it was once we got to know them in their particular cases that we understood what was needed. So I think that the lesson would be that it would be nice to know that we can apply these tools not only at design, but also keep it flexible enough, both the tool and the design of the project, so that we can adapt as we go. The second lesson is that it's important to identify the risks of leaving them behind. In this project, I think we made the mistake of not including the youth in the new industrial processes. There were some new machines that were imported, some technical issues that we thought that somebody else external to the project would be better at handling. And I think now at hindsight that this was a mistake. I think that the project should have trained the women, the young women in the project to make them more empowered and give them more ownership, even of the technical details of the machines, in terms of the maintenance, entertainment and stuff. And the last one is that it's important to pay attention to the group dynamics. I think that although youth have very much, specific things that need to be taken into account, they live in a group, they work in a group, and they are part of a family. In the olive oil production, something very interesting that happened is that the young women wanted to participate more in the marketing strategy, go into the market to sell. And this clashed a little bit with the tradition. and also with the elder women of the group who were also the owners of the land where the olive trees were planted. This very interesting social problem or issue should have been studied more in depth to give more adapted response to the group as a group. Yeah, so I wanted to contribute with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much for sharing. And you've raised some key points. Your lessons learned are very helpful, as you can see from others who are responding. Is there anyone else who would like to share verbally? Don't be shy. We'd love to hear from you on any of these if you feel like sharing in the Padlet's not as effective for you. Perhaps we could take this moment here as well to kind of review what's being expressed in the Padlet and kind of just taking a moment. I don't know if Catherine, you would, or Stephanie would want to kind of just like review some of the comments that you're seeing there. Particularly like in the use of the toolkit, if anyone has found it particularly useful, or what sections. Looks like it's varied responses. Some have not heard of it before. Some have heard of it and maybe not used it and read it and not used it in an actual project setting, while others are expressing some of the things with regards to connections in components, the integration of youth into market systems approach. Anyone find any ahas in this about the use of the toolkit or comments that they'd like to share? Please feel free to come off them off mic and off mute. Let's move on to then question number 2, the practices, entry points, or partnerships that best support youth engagement and empowerment in agriculture, and see what some of the responses here are.
Lisa, it looks like someone in the webinar asked about if others have examples where the Ministry of Agriculture is engaging with youth. And I know that one of the responses started talking about this. So if
great.
that person would like to, could share a little bit more about that, or share the country or where people could find more information, that would be wonderful.
Yes, please. Don't be shy. We'd love to hear from you.
So if
Lisa, I can jump in a little bit, and Christy, Allison, I wonder, if you could share some of your experiences as well. I've seen in several different contexts where the Ministry of Ag, they have the genuine want of having young people engaged and in the agricultural sector. We all know the statistics. We all know that producers are statistically getting older, that the solution is, having a wide number of young people in there. Lisa, you started us out. Christy, you talked about it, the youth bulge. We can all see the reasons why we need to have that robust side. Some of the places that I've seen of where there's been some challenges of like ideas and wants and turning into practice is in that how and how to build it on out. And I think that Alejandra, you gave some really explicit examples of we want young people in the olive, oil production systems. Like we genuinely want this. But how do we go about that? And what does it mean? And what are some of the trade-offs for it? And I think that, hopefully the guide helps, of kind of working on whether, and I know it's designed for USAID, but some of the ministries and some of their designs, and really thinking about this from a youth lens. Alejandra, I think that it was really, you're telling her like, but what do young people need? And what young people are going to engage with this? Is it going to be a 28-year-old male, or is it going to be a 19-year-old female? How might that be different for them? What could that look like to really hone down on some of those more targeted sides? And so, I think that I've seen a lot of ministries that are really excited and want to engage, but I think that they've anecdotally heard, oh, it worked over here in this country. Can we get that to work here? Instead of, all right, here's systematically what we know works and some of the trade-offs and some of the different ways to be able to get to those successes. So, Christy, I don't know if you've got kind of some other insights.
I do. I actually have a couple of very recent examples. So I was out, had the great fortune of a couple months ago of being out in Madagascar, and doing an assessment out there, looking at youth in the food system and how they might be able to engage and how the systems there might better support them. And one of the things that emerged was that there are Ministry of Ag, Ministry of Fisheries and Blue Economy, and the Ministry of Youth all have very concerted efforts, sort of in the pipeline to help train youth and to help create opportunities for them. I think the interesting part, what we found was that it was all very supply side driven, which is not uncommon. But there were small things that we identified that they could do. So, for example, for Ministry of Fisheries, island nation, fishing is a significant component of the economy for many communities. Youth were gaining skills. What they couldn't do is come up with the capital to equip themselves individually to go out and start their own fishing businesses. They could buy a piece here or a piece there. And so what they really needed was ways to set up partnerships, and, sort of group enterprises where they could all contribute something, and how to set up what would an equitable partnership look like and how would you govern that. And so there was some, basic, not basic, but sort of common needs in terms of how could they, sort of what would these business supports look like. And so there were some things that, they can put out toolkits. There are things they can provide as supports to youth to overcome some of those kinds of barriers when there's a market and when there are skills, and we just need a way to combine resources equitably and have systems to ensure that everyone, gets back what they're contributing, and that people are not taken advantage of in that process. The Ministry of Youth had a really strong program, and they're trying to socialize with the other ministries because they think accompaniment is important for the first couple of production cycles. That's great, but they only have resources in the capital, which is not where the majority of youth are doing agriculture there. So now they're looking for opportunities to partner and explore and figure out how they can build on those other training programs and partner. So, I think there are opportunities and there are ways for ministries to build on some of the really good work they're already doing. It sometimes takes a little creativity and a little, sort of getting down at the ground level and understanding what are those day-to-day barriers that people are facing. And sometimes, those are the way to go. Land tenure continues to be a major challenge with that as well. So, and those solutions are going to look different in many cases, but I think there are ways, for those ministries to show that leadership. Sometimes they're a little too far removed from the day-to-day to understand where the gap is, right? And so where USAID can help them bridge that gap, we're helping. We can be helping.
Yeah. And Christy, you just touched on this here, and I know that this was in the Padlet, and multiple people talked about the grants and the small
Yep.
grants. And if anybody has implemented grants, you know that a $5,000 grant is just as much work to implement as a $500,000 grant. And the systems that are there. And part of that is, really kind of needing to clean up some of the grant processes and, and really look at it and say, is this really necessary for what is considered those micro grants and being able to get stuff up and going, and how can things be structured to help that? But that is a really, really big space of being able to move forward, as well as flexible grants. And this is something that when I worked in Kenya on the KCDMS project, we spent a while really looking in at knowing that youth were really going to be in a transition place, but how do you give a grant and expect that it is going to get morphed into different things? And so you might give a grant that starts about chicken production, and maybe a year later, they're no longer in chicken production. They've liquidated all of that and they moved on to goats, because goats are a higher asset. And that's not a negative thing of, oh, you're no longer in chicken production, like all of these assets that we gave you are gone, but a very positive thing of you are progressing your skills, your assets, your resources, and that's a natural pathway that's there. And so I think that getting those grants on out there again, like where do these ministries, bringing that flexibility on in there, and letting young people run, as their pathways change, as their life changes. Yeah, it can be very fun to watch, as long as you're not trying to stay attached to a certain, which I know, Christina, you're an M&E person, like a certain indicator, a certain this, did these businesses do this, but of really building in that flexibility up front, because yeah, young people are going to be dynamic. They're going to do different things.
Well, and I think that's where, from my perspective, that gap we saw in the theories of change in terms of not understanding, and someone, raised this in the Padlet as well, the patterns are very clear. The entry point is generally not where, and you don't want them to stay there, right? You want them to move up that value chain or switch to another value chain if that's more advantageous. And that, understanding that and allowing and creating a theory of change that anticipates that,
Yep.
That permits for that, then should drive all of those, that should drive your indicators, that should drive your evaluation system. So it's not something punitive if a youth moves out of one sector and into another, so long as it's actually the right move for them, right? That would be a good outcome.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
and that's where those gaps where we still need to work on filling some of that in and making sure people are really understanding what does success look like. It's not just that we've got this sector. It's that we've actually got ag-led growth, and that some of these youth may actually move out of the ag sector as you have structural transformation in their countries, right?
And I appreciate the fact that you guys are pulling in that. There was also someone who mentioned something about in Colombia also, maybe as an example of a project. I'm going to jump in here with a project that is being done with USDA Foreign Ag Service folks, but it's looking at how to institutionalize, because you were talking earlier about the TVET and the educational part. So you train, but remember, the person who receives the training becomes an adult eventually, right? So the question is, how do you have an ongoing system of training and weak extension systems, weak educational systems? So the crafting and creating with the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Youth, the Ministry of Education, and systems, government, public, and then looking at the private sector where the need is, perhaps either for the value chain, but to recognize that it has to allow for youth to come in at different parts. One of the projects that I've been seeing work on is where it is a higher education institution becoming the outreach and engagement for the education of the quote University Extension Center that is going to be looking at climate smart agriculture within communities. And the best place for them to do it is in schools. And so they're crafting and creating those demonstration plots, because the project that I worked with was the 4-H program. And the way they trained, the way they trained adults was to have youth be the ones to take the challenge, the initiative, the risk in doing things, to then teach the adults. And the cool part about that was also how it engaged adults who are willing and had that mindset of working with young people. Now, that's a model I'm familiar with, but it has to be tweaked. But I guess part of it's also recognizing, how do we engage public and private in this conversation? Just curious if anyone wants to come off mute or and share anything in particular you're hearing from your panelists here as we continue the dialogue.
Lisa, you're on mute.
Yeah, I just did that. Are there any questions folks might have for anyone? Christy, Hillary, Laura, Ubidi, just curious, or of each other that you'd like to raise.
So I just wanted to thank you, Lisa, for giving that kind of concrete example. I think sometimes in these webinars, pictures and clear examples of what projects are doing are great for the audience. Christine, it was so great though to see your research and kind of a zoom out, and understand across so many programs. So, and I just wanted to say, because I went into the tablet over here on my machine, so I was anonymous, but I suggested, going forward, and I want to encourage everybody to go into the tablet. This is your chance to just tell us what needs to happen. What is your recommendation for the next research product, for the next funding mechanism? Tell us now. This is your chance to speak up. People are looking at what's being said. I was the one who said, is there some research product on generations in agriculture? Everywhere we go, where we're working in the ag sector, there is this concern about youth not wanting to be on the farms. There's been some work on, tech and ag value chains and agribusiness, but the actual farming work is so technical, is so scientific. There are so many, breakthroughs in terms of organic and other types of production. Things are changing in the US. We were just in Texas at an urban agriculture center. And Ilvudi and I spent 3 hours in somebody's backyard. I don't know if anybody has ever tasted a lemon cucumber, but I had never had one before. It's really good. So yeah, just want to encourage everybody in the last few minutes, and then thank our amazing researchers and panelists. And Ilvudi is going to kind of close it out and speaking on behalf of herself and Jack, since Jack isn't able to have sound today. Thank you, guys.
Okay, does anybody else have any additional comments before we close out this wonderful discussion today? Okay, so, well, it was great talking about agriculture youth and the toolkit that's been developed to include youth in the agricultural value chains. And I want to thank our wonderful speakers today, Lisa, Hillary, and Christine. and as well as Alejandra that shared her experience with us in Morocco, and everybody who participated today in this wonderful discussion. And I also want to thank all BEPC members that always participated in all our webinars since 2021 and former speakers. Yes, the community is closing out, but we want to stay in touch with you. You can stay connected with us on LinkedIn and also with the other resources that we've shared with you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody.